I never expected betrayal to come sealed in a white envelope. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, one of those painfully ordinary days where the world feels still, but something in the air tells you it's about to break. The envelope sat on my kitchen counter beside a half-empty coffee mug and the bills I couldn't bring myself to open. My name was written in my father's handwriting, neat, controlled, and cold. It had been 8 months since we last spoke. I should have known then that the letter would hurt. My father was never one for apologies, and he wasn't the type to write unless he had something final to say. My heart thumped as I tore the seal open, the sound of paper ripping slicing through the quiet. Inside was a short note, printed on his office stationery. It started with, "To my daughter, Emma," formal, detached, and by the time I reached the last line, my hands were shaking. "In the event of my passing, all my estate, properties, and assets shall be transferred to my wife, Melissa Carter. I trust her to make the right decisions regarding your future." That was it. No warmth. No explanation. Just the legal translation of "you get nothing." I read it again, slower this time, my throat burning. Melissa, his new wife, had been in his life barely 2 years. She was younger, beautiful in that overly polished way, the kind that smelled of money and manipulation. I never liked her. The way she'd smile at me, thin and sweet, as if she already owned everything. Now, I realized she did. That was the moment something in me cracked. The sadness turned into something colder. Something sharper. I wasn't just left out of a will. I was erased, replaced. And I wasn't going to let that stand. I met Melissa Carter for the first time at a restaurant my father couldn't stop talking about, The Haven, a sleek place in downtown Chicago where the lighting was dim and the prices were loud. I remember feeling small there, sitting across from them at a table that smelled like truffle oil and ego. Dad had been distant ever since my mother died 3 years earlier. I'd tried to fill the silence, calls, visits, holidays, but every time I reached out, I felt the invisible wall between us grow thicker. And then, suddenly, there she was, Melissa. She was a realtor, or luxury property consultant, as she preferred to call herself. Perfect nails, perfect posture, and a smile that could sell sin as virtue. She slipped her hand over my father's like she was claiming territory. "Emma," she said, her voice silky and fake, "your father tells me you're in graduate school. How wonderful. I didn't have the discipline for that sort of thing when I was your age." She couldn't have been more than 10 years older than me. I smiled back, polite but distant. "It's not easy, but it's worth it." Dad chuckled, missing the tension completely. "Melissa's been helping me reorganize my life, Em. She's got this incredible energy. You should see how she handles business." I wanted to ask what business meant. My father was a retired contractor, not some mogul in need of a life coach. But I didn't. I just nodded, sipped my overpriced wine, and listened to her talk about real estate trends while she rubbed my father's hand like she was massaging a checkbook. That night, as we said goodbye in the parking lot, Melissa hugged me, tight, too long, and whispered in my ear, "Your dad deserves to be happy again. Don't you agree?" I smiled stiffly. Of course. But inside, I was already suspicious. 2 years later, my father barely spoke to me. Calls went unanswered. Messages ignored. When I did manage to visit, Melissa was always there, hovering, inserting herself into every conversation. My father's warmth, what little was left of it, had been replaced by her voice guiding his thoughts. And then came the last time I saw him alive. He'd invited me to the house, their house now. Melissa greeted me at the door, dressed in white like some smug angel. The place looked like a museum, expensive art, minimalist decor, not a trace of the man who used to build furniture in our garage with sawdust in his hair. "Emma," she said, leading me in. "So glad you could make it. Your father's been resting, he's been under a lot of stress lately." When I found him in his office, he looked older. Thinner. His eyes, once so sure, darted away from mine. Dad, are you okay? I asked. He sighed. Just tired, Em. Melissa's been handling most of the paperwork lately. I'm lucky to have her. I bit my tongue. Paperwork. That word would come back to haunt me. We talked, awkwardly, about nothing that mattered. Then I left, sensing that something had been said in the silence between us. Something final. 3 weeks later, he was gone. Heart attack, they said. Peaceful. Melissa arranged everything, the service, the obituary, even the seating at the funeral. I was allowed to read a poem. That was my contribution. After the burial, she hugged me again, tears glistening in her eyes. He loved you, Emma, she whispered. He just didn't know how to show it. When the lawyer called about the will, I went alone. Melissa showed up wearing a black designer dress, pretending grief was fashion. She brought coffee for everyone, even the lawyer. I didn't take mine. The lawyer, Mr. Sanderson, looked uncomfortable, like he already knew I wouldn't like what he had to say. He cleared his throat, flipping through papers. Mr. Carter's last will and testament states that the entirety of his estate, including all liquid assets, properties, and investments, will be transferred to his spouse, Mrs. Melissa Carter. He paused, glancing at me. There is no other beneficiary listed. Melissa sighed dramatically and placed a hand on my shoulder. Oh, Emma, he must have assumed I'd take care of you. You're still so young. Of course, you can stay here until you get on your feet. The words sliced through me, the false sympathy, the ownership in her tone. I smiled tightly. That's generous. But I'll be fine. Inside, I was burning. That night, I went home and opened my father's old laptop, the one he'd given me when I started college. He'd wiped it clean, but he wasn't as tech-savvy as he thought. I found fragments of documents, old emails, and one folder labeled contracts. Inside were scanned files, business transfers, account statements, legal drafts, all with her name on them. Melissa hadn't just married him. She'd managed him. Controlled him. And finally, she'd stripped him of everything he owned, before his heart ever gave out. I remember staring at her signature under his elegant, practiced, poisonous, and whispering to myself. You think you've won? That's when the revenge began forming in my mind, quietly, like smoke curling in a dark room. For the next few weeks after the will reading, my world blurred into something numb. People like to say grief comes in waves, but mine came like static, loud, endless, and empty. I stopped answering calls from relatives, stopped going to classes. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's face the way it looked the last time I saw him, tired, hollow, and not quite his own. Melissa had taken over everything, just like she always wanted. She sold his truck, replaced his old armchair, even redecorated his office, the same room where he used to design blueprints, the same room that had smelled of wood and ink when I was a kid. Now it smelled like vanilla candles and deceit. A week after the funeral, she sent me a text. Hey sweetheart, just checking in. I've arranged for the house to be appraised next week. Don't worry, I'll keep a few of your dad's things for you. That heart at the end made me nauseous. I typed a reply, keep what you want. I don't care. And hit send before I could soften it. But I did care. More than I wanted to admit. What ate at me wasn't just that she got everything, it was that my father had let her. That he'd signed it all away, knowingly or not, as if I was just another detail in his life that could be deleted with a pen stroke. The betrayal didn't just come from her. It came from him too. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Something didn't add up. I spent nights going through old family records, emails, even photos, anything that could explain how he'd gone from a careful man with a lifetime of savings to someone who handed over everything to a woman who barely knew him. And then, one night, buried in his old email archives, I found it. A forwarded message 6 months before he died. The subject line, urgent, property transfer request. The message read, "Please confirm you wish to transfer ownership of the Lakeview property to Melissa Carter before finalizing your estate documents." And there, attached, was a digital signature, my father's. Except it wasn't his. The scrawl was wrong. Too neat. Too deliberate. I stared at it for a long time, heart pounding. Melissa hadn't just manipulated him. She'd forged him. And the more I looked, the more I realized how deep it went: bank statements, insurance updates, account closures. All routed through her email, her name, her control. She hadn't just taken advantage of a grieving man. She'd orchestrated the entire downfall. That night, sitting in the glow of my laptop screen, I whispered something I hadn't said out loud in years. "I'm going to ruin you." And I meant it. The next time I saw Melissa, she was smiling for a camera. Someone had tagged her on Instagram, a photo of her at a charity gala, glass of champagne in hand, laughing beside the mayor's wife. The caption read, "The radiant Melissa Carter, giving back after a tough year." The comments were full of sympathy. "Such strength. Your husband would be so proud. Inspiring woman." I wanted to throw my phone. Instead, I started studying her. I watched every video, read every post, tracked every company she'd ever been associated with. It turned out Melissa wasn't just a realtor, she was a strategist. Her entire career had been built on charm, deception, and careful social climbing. Every man she dated before my father had money or connections. Every breakup ended with her coming out richer, smarter, and more connected. She was a professional predator. So if she wanted to play that game, I'd play it better. I started small. I reconnected with one of my father's old business partners, a quiet man named Raymond Holt. He'd helped my father on construction contracts years ago and had always liked me as a kid. When I called, he sounded surprised to hear from me. "Emma? Good to hear your voice, sweetheart. How are you holding up?" I hesitated. "Not great, Ray. I need your help." He listened as I explained the will, the suspicious documents, the forged signature. There was a long pause before he spoke. "I'm not surprised," he said finally. "Your dad wasn't himself those last few years. He told me Melissa handled everything. I didn't like it, but he seemed happy, so I stayed out of it." "Do you think she could've?" I didn't even finish the sentence. "I think she could have done anything if it benefited her," he said quietly. "Listen, Emma, I've got some of your dad's old files. Contracts, copies of signatures, the kind of stuff a lawyer would drool over. You want them?" "Yes," I said. "Absolutely." The next day, he sent me a folder through email, old PDFs, scanned contracts, notes. And inside, I found gold. A document titled Power of Attorney Transfer, Draft. It gave Melissa complete control over my father's financial and legal affairs, but it was never signed by a witness. No notary stamp, no validation. Meaning it was worthless. Unless she'd faked one later. And if she had, that was a felony. That realization hit me like caffeine to the bloodstream. I wasn't just a grieving daughter anymore. I was a detective with motive. But revenge couldn't just be legal. That would be too easy. Melissa thrived on public perception, she fed on being admired, respected, adored. So the only way to destroy her was to take that away. I needed her world to crumble publicly, just like mine had privately. And to do that, I needed to get close again, close enough to make her believe I'd forgiven her. That was where the plan began. It started with an email. "Hi Melissa. I've been thinking a lot about Dad. You were right, he did deserve to be happy. I don't want us to hate each other. Maybe we could talk sometime?" Her reply came within 10 minutes. "Oh Emma, this makes me so happy to hear. I've missed you. Let's have lunch soon, my treat." Of course. The heart again. Always the heart. When I met her at the Haven, the same restaurant where I'd met her years ago, she looked radiant, like grief had polished her instead of broken her. She hugged me, air-kissed my cheek, and ordered champagne before I'd even sat down. "You look beautiful," she said. "Your father would be proud." I forced a smile. "Thank you. You look, well." We talked for an hour. She told me about her new charity foundation, how she was planning to host a fundraiser in my father's memory. I played along, nodding, pretending to admire her dedication. Then she said something that nearly made me choke on my drink. "You know, I've been thinking of setting up a scholarship in your name, something for young women in business. It's the least I can do, after everything." I stared at her, fighting the urge to laugh. After everything. She was rewriting the story, turning herself into a saint and me into a cause. I smiled sweetly. "That's incredibly kind of you." Inside, I was already planning how to weaponize it. Because if Melissa wanted to build her reputation on lies, then I was going to make sure those lies turned to poison. That night, I started writing down everything: timelines, connections, accounts, public posts. I mapped her life like a web, with my father's name right in the center. I reached out to one of my classmates in law school, Daniel, who owed me a favor, and asked him to look into something for me. Specifically, whether any of my father's documents had been refiled or notarized after the fact. A week later, he called me. "Emma, I think you're onto something. There's a notarized power of attorney form filed 2 months before your dad died, but the notary signature belongs to a woman who died 3 years earlier." I froze. "What?" "Yeah. Melissa Carter submitted a document signed by a dead notary. That's fraud." I felt my pulse quicken. "Can you get me a copy?" "Already sent it. Check your email." When I opened the file, I stared at the falsified page, my father's shaky signature, the fake notary seal, the timestamp that didn't match his handwriting samples. This wasn't just unethical. It was criminal. And with that, I realized something terrifyingly thrilling. I had the power to destroy her. But destroying her privately wasn't enough. I wanted the world to see her fall. I knew humiliating Melissa wouldn't be easy. She wasn't stupid, she was practiced. The whole of her life was choreography, knowing where to stand, whom to smile at, and how to make a camera fall in love with her. But charisma is a fragile thing when its foundations are fraud. First, I built an audience. If you want to ruin someone who trades in public adoration, you have to turn the court of public opinion against them. I started small, anonymous tips to local reporters, carefully worded, not accusations, just questions. "Has anyone looked into the notary on Melissa Carter's submitted documents? Is there a record of this scholarship being properly funded?" I knew how journalists think: give them a lead that smelled like corruption and ego, and they'll dig. I also fed the fire on social media. I created an account that was nothing more than brittle honesty, a tight feed of scanned documents, side-by-side comparisons of signatures, and short captions that asked the right questions. I used the name Justice for Em at first, then switched to something less melodramatic as the account gained traction. People began sharing. The local crime bloggers sniffed something juicy and started cross-posting. A few days later, a finance reporter from a city paper reached out to me for an interview, anonymous, of course. But the real work was quieter and more surgical. I started going to Melissa's events. She loved the spotlight. She loved being seen grieving in charity press photos. She loved appearing on panels about philanthropy while wearing bracelets that cost more than most people's rent. So I went to them. At first I sat in the back, notebook in hand, looking like another intern who wanted a chance at a career. Sometimes I was bored and left early. Sometimes I stayed until the bitter end, watching how she operated, who hugged her, who whispered in her ear, the way she repositioned the spotlight when a camera shutter clicked. At a gala she was hosting in my father's name, I did something that made my stomach flip and my soul hum with cold satisfaction. I signed up as a volunteer. They needed help at the check-in desk, and because she was trying to show how inclusive and hands-on she could be, she insisted volunteers be visible. That night, dressed in black and wielding a clipboard, I watched her work the room while servers poured champagne and the mayor praised her on stage. I also had another job, quietly handing envelopes to a lawyer friend of mine, Daniel, and to Raymond, my father's old partner. Each envelope contained copies of forged documents, old bank statements, and anything else that showed a pattern. I'd positioned myself so the people with the authority to make noise were close enough to the action. The goal wasn't only criminal prosecution. It was reputational collapse. Halfway through the evening, when Melissa took the stage for her speech about legacy, I sent a single email, the kind that feels like a match dropped into dry tinder. It went to a reporter I trusted, to the board of one of the charities she used as a front, and to 2 city council aides. The subject line was simple: evidence of fraud, Melissa Carter, immediate review requested. Attached, notarized power of attorney, bank transfers into a shell account, a certificate that didn't exist in her claimed foundation's records. I watched her from my check-in desk as she smiled into the microphone. She spoke about honor, stewardship, and the importance of trust. I felt bile rise in my throat. She was talking about trust while she had been stealing the very trust people gave her. Then phones began to buzz. At first a murmur, a staffer excusing themselves, hurried conversation in a corner. Then a louder ripple. One of the city council aides stood up mid-speech and walked briskly toward a woman by the entrance. The reporter I'd emailed sent a text that read, "On our way." "Are you sure?" I texted back 2 words, "Trust me." By the time Melissa finished, there were 3 men in suits by the stage. One of them was the reporter. Another, I later learned, was an investigator from the county attorney's office. The third was a representative from the charity's national board. They asked for her after her speech, and the smiling mask she wore for the cameras cracked just a little, a micro-expression that was deliciously human and immediately damning. They asked to see her foundation's paperwork. They asked about the scholarship she had claimed to be setting up in my name. They asked where the funds were. She floundered. The investigators showed her the notarized power of attorney with the dead notary's stamp. She explained it away the way practiced liars do, with controlled outrage and plausible confusion. She claimed an assistant had handled the documents. She promised full cooperation. But promises don't erase paper. Within 48 hours of the gala, the charity suspended her foundation pending review. The local paper published a 2-page exposé with copies of the questionable documents I'd supplied. The hashtag Melissa Files trended regionally for 3 days. Donors called to withdraw their pledges. The gala's major sponsor publicly announced they were rescinding their support. It was intoxicating to see the armor she had built around herself start to corrode. The glamour was peeling. The friends who'd posed with her photos were suddenly putting distance between themselves and her feed. Melissa's Instagram comments turned nasty. People who had praised her were now asking if she was a fraud. And yet she didn't fall immediately. She doubled down with PR statements, tearful interviews, and an Instagram video where she claimed she'd been duped by a rogue assistant. It wasn't enough. The dead notary was an unignorable fact. The bank transfers were a trail of breadcrumbs to a shell corporation she controlled. This was the art of slow humiliation: expose the truth, then let people watch it collapse in real time. Humiliation was one thing. Conviction was another. I wanted both the public spectacle and the legal finality. For that, I needed collaboration. The county investigator was good, but they moved like a glacier and I needed the glacier to speed up. So I stitched together a coalition: Raymond with his old contacts in construction and finance, Daniel with his legal knowledge and contacts in the prosecutor's office, a freelance investigative journalist who smelled corruption like a bloodhound, and me, with scraps of my father's life and a grudge that wouldn't calm. The plan had 3 parts. Part 1: build an airtight record linking Melissa to forgery and financial exploitation. That meant locating bank records, wiring traces, contract signings, and witnesses. We needed a paper trail so thick even a clever PR team couldn't spin around it. Part 2. Undermine her social capital. Continue the public exposure but do it strategically. Release documents to the press only when we had corroboration. Leak email chains that showed intent. Introduce witnesses who'd been preyed on before. Rumors die quickly in the absence of facts. We had to generate facts. Part 3. Make sure she couldn't hide behind my father's name. I wanted people to know what she had done to him specifically, that she had forced him into decisions he wouldn't have made and that, before he died, he had known and, this was the part that mattered to me, felt remorse. That last part was a risk. My father had been weak in those final months. He had let Melissa manage his affairs, and if he genuinely didn't understand what he'd signed, I couldn't find him to explain. But there was one lead I hadn't checked earlier, his voicemail backups and a small external hard drive he kept locked in his office drawer. I'd assumed it was gone with him. Raymond had the key to the house. I asked him to check. He called me at midnight with breathing loud on the line. "You really should sit down," he said. "I found something." When I got to the house, the office still smelled faintly of cedar, like my father had been there only yesterday. Raymond handed me the hard drive wrapped in a paper towel. He'd pried the drawer open with a screwdriver like a thief on principle. We plugged it into my laptop in the kitchen, both of us holding our breath. There were audio files labeled in his handwriting, M_final, confession, notes. I clicked the first one. The voice that came through was croaky, older than the man I remembered, but it was unmistakably his. "Emma," he began, his voice catching. "If you're listening to this, I'm sorry. I don't know if I had any sense left when it happened. Melissa, she was good. Too good. She made living easy. She made me feel like I deserved to rest. But I think I let her make choices for me that weren't mine." He paused. There was a faint sound of someone breathing in the background, a woman's laugh, and then he continued, quieter, shameful. "I signed things because I trusted her. I signed because she told me it would be easier. If I hurt you, I'm sorry. I should have listened. I should have, I'm ashamed." I felt something inside me unclench. Not victory, not yet, but a strange, aching closure. He had known. He had realized he'd been manipulated. He'd tried to leave a record. The file ended with him whispering, "Forgive me," and a ragged breath. I cried then, but it wasn't the raw, wailing grief I'd felt at the funeral. It was a complicated thing, loss braided with a small, sharp satisfaction. He had realized, however belatedly, that he had been wrong. That mattered to me more than I expected. With that recording in hand, our case gained a human heartbeat. It wasn't just a stack of forged papers anymore, it was a man's confession that he'd been used. That bolstered our credibility with the prosecutor. But the plan needed more than audio. It needed a smoking gun. Daniel and the investigator traced the shell corporations and found a payment trail leading to Melissa's personal account, wire transfers that coincided with expensive purchases, a second condo, a designer wardrobe, a luxury car. The pattern screamed exploitation. The bank records showed transfers from accounts in my father's name to accounts controlled by entities registered under names that circled back to her. We obtained subpoenas. We interviewed a woman who'd worked as Melissa's assistant at the time, a timid thing who confessed she'd been instructed to clean up paperwork and soften signatures. She remembered a notary the company used, Madeline Cross, and then stopped, tears catching in her throat. "Madeline died 3 years ago," she said. "But Melissa used her stamp file. She told me she trusted Madeline's records." Madeline Cross's estate manager confirmed the stamp set had been found missing and later turned up among Melissa's belongings, a discovery that made the investigators' eyes light up like a predator's. We assembled the pieces and presented them to the county prosecutor. They assigned a special fraud unit. Within weeks, Melissa was formally charged with multiple counts: forgery, elder financial exploitation, conspiracy to commit fraud. The allegations hit the press with the force of a thrown stone. I thought the most satisfying moment would be the courtroom, or her name in headlines. But the real pleasure was more intimate, watching her face change when people she'd used began to speak. At her arraignment, the assistant testified about the fake notary and the instructions she'd been given. Raymond testified about how my father's decision-making had been overridden. The recording of my father's confession was submitted as evidence. It was, in a small, terrible way, a eulogy and a legal document at once. But I didn't stop there. Public shame only sticks when you make people see the person behind the lie. So I did something else. I started leaving notes. Short notes, slid into mailboxes of people who had donated to Melissa's charities, written from the perspective of those she'd used, not accusatory, just factual. This is Emma Carter. My father was taken advantage of. Please review your donation. The notes were polite, precise, and attached to copies of the documents. People replied with anger and then apology. Donor lists emptied. Board members resigned. Each resignation was a small tax on her pride. Of course, she fought back. Her lawyers issued denials, counterclaims, and statements about misunderstandings. She had a veneer of support from a few close allies who couldn't imagine she would do such a thing. But that veneer cracked publicly. Lawyers don't thrive on sympathy. I wanted to make the humiliation theatrical, though, not merely a slow erosion. So, with the investigative journalist's help, we arranged a press conference. The journalist asked if I would speak. I almost refused. Public speaking had always made me shake, but then I remembered the nights I'd sat in my father's old chair and listened to his breath. I remembered Melissa's hands on my father's shoulder as if she'd taken him like an object. I took the podium. My voice was steady, and it felt like a blade. I am Emma Carter, I told the cameras. My father was betrayed. He was taken by someone he loved and trusted. I am here because he couldn't speak for himself. But I can. I played the recording of his voice. The room was silent. People who had cheered Melissa at galas now watched a daughter deliver an unvarnished portrait of deception. Tears streamed from my cheeks as I read the timeline from memory, the documents, the notary, the transfers. I didn't shout. I didn't sensationalize. I laid out the facts and let them land. The mayor who once praised her for philanthropy issued a statement later that evening expressing deep concern. Several high-profile donors announced they were retracting support. Melissa's PR team scrambled, her lawyers prepared for trial. She stopped posting photos of charity events and started hiding behind legal statements. But the best part came a few weeks later, when one of her closest friends, someone who had often been in photos with her at fundraisers, publicly returned an engraved plaque Melissa had given her, citing a loss of trust. The small items, the tokens of friendship, were the most painful losses for her. They were proof that the trickle had become a flood. Humiliation, rendered in public and procedural form, had done its work. The last thing that remained was a verdict from a court of law, and the knowledge that my father had realized, before he died, the full scale of her betrayal. That realization, small as it felt in the vortex of legal action, was all I had asked for at the beginning. It wasn't enough to silence the hole his death left, but it proved one thing: the man who had made mistakes had owned them, even if it was only in a handful of late-night recordings. And as the legal wheels turned, Melissa's life, once polished and shimmering, became a cautionary tale. The empire of curated appearances crumbled when the underpinnings were exposed. People watched her fall not with joy so much as with the cold satisfaction that comes from seeing a gram of truth tip the balance of a polished lie. I learned early on that the best way to catch a predator is to let them think they've already eaten. So I walked back into Melissa's orbit with a smile and a script. I surrendered myself to being underestimated, the grieving daughter who'd forgiven and wanted to reconnect. It felt like acting, but more honest actors had better chances at the truth. People reveal themselves when they're sure they've won. Melissa loved rituals. She liked to stage afternoons that looked effortless, brunches at sunlit terraces, curated charity visits with photo ops, late-night strategy calls that always ended in laughter and champagne. I swam in those rituals, learning the language of her world. I volunteered for the scholarship committee she'd launched. I showed up at meetings with notebooks, pretending to be grateful and naive. I smiled through the condescending lectures about networking and image. It was exhausting. It was also effective. From the inside, you can see the seams. Melissa kept two kinds of people around her, the visible ones who posed for photos and the invisible ones who did the unglamorous work, the assistants, bookkeepers, drivers, and lawyers who never made it to the highlights reel. The invisible people were where the truth lived. They were the ones who handled receipts, stamps, and dusty bank ledgers. My first real break came from one of those invisibles, a man named Javier, who'd been Melissa's driver for years. He was quiet, spoke with a slow Mexican cadence, and had a face like someone who had learned to read people to survive. He'd watched Melissa move in, watched her buy trinkets and furniture with money that hadn't come from her ex-husband's. He saw strange envelopes, late-night visitors, and the way Melissa became flustered whenever paperwork arrived. At a fundraiser 3 months after the scandal broke, I found him at the coat check, eyes avoiding cameras. I sat beside him, offered coffee, and listened. People who drive people talk, it's what they do when their passengers aren't watching. She always kept a black briefcase in the trunk, he told me in a whisper. Never let anyone touch it. Once I asked what was inside and she said it was private. Not for drivers. Did you ever see anything in it? I asked. He shook his head. Sometimes she would change the contents. Papers. Cash. At times she would hand me an envelope and say, "Take this to the bank." She gave me instructions, but I never looked. He didn't know the details. He didn't need to. Drivers see patterns, auditors see details. Javier's pattern led me to the next invisible, Simone, Melissa's personal assistant, the timid woman who had folded her hands at galas and smiled as if she didn't have a mind of her own. Simone was terrified the first time she agreed to meet me at a coffee shop. She had that fresh-off-the-bus look of someone caught between loyalty and legal peril. I promised anonymity. I promised protection. Mostly, I promised to listen. She told me things that made my skin crawl, copies of checks rerouted, invoices created for services that never happened, and receipts for charitable events that matched no bank deposits. She showed me photos she'd taken for herself, an image of a notarized stamp laid on a kitchen counter with Melissa's lipstick nearby, a text from Melissa reading, "Make sure no one notices the notary's name isn't listed." She'd saved drafts of emails that read like rehearsed statements. If anyone asks about the notary, say the assistant handled it. When she told me Melissa had started hoarding cash in a safe installed behind a painting, I didn't hesitate. That painting was essential. I asked Simone for details and then asked her to do something small, leave a copy of one of Melissa's memos on the office printer where I could accidentally find it. She did it because finally someone was listening and because the truth was heavier than the fear of losing a job. That memo, an innocuous one-page schedule of wire transfers, had dates, amounts, and the names of shell entities. It was the sort of thing financial people call a breadcrumb. To anyone else, it would appear to be a routine administrative file. To me, it was a map. With Javier's observations, Simone's memos, and the recording from my father's hard drive, Daniel and the prosecutor's team had more than circumstantial suspicion. We had corroborating witnesses. We still needed proof of the safe and the painting. One rainy night, Simone texted me, she left the office late. The painting is unguarded. I asked her to send a photo. Her hands shook so badly that at first the image was blurred. Then it settled, a large abstract with heavy impasto, the kind shows used to hide safes behind. The painting hung in Melissa's study, the room that used to be my father's office. Simone agreed to help us get the painting down. It wasn't an illegal break-in, she'd cleanly remove the painting while the house was empty and bring it to Raymond to store until the legal team could get a warrant. We were careful. We were surgical. When they pried the frame from the wall in a cleaning closet behind a thrift of tacky furniture, they found the safe. It was bricked into the wall like a secret within a secret. Opening it felt like opening someone's skull, private possessions spilling into the light. Inside were ledgers, envelopes, a small stack of cash wrapped in rubber bands, and a leather folder. The folder contained receipts for transfers, contracts with shell company names, and, like a cherry on a poisoned cake, an old notary stamp box with Madeleine Cross engraved on the inside lid. We all stared at that stamp as if it were a talisman. The investigator took pictures, the prosecutor frowned, and Simone cried because the weight of what she'd been part of finally landed in a real place. That safe, when presented in court, was an indisputable piece of theater. It bridged the abstract documents to a physical act of concealment. Melissa tried to explain. At first she claimed she'd inherited the painting and the safe. She said she kept personal mementos there. She claimed innocence. Then, in private, she called Simone and offered her money, apartments, and legal aid if she kept quiet. Simone didn't take the money. She came forward. From infiltration, we moved to exposure. From exposure, the trap tightened. People bluff until the cards are on the table. That's human nature. Melissa bluffed hard. She launched counter-narratives, hired PR specialists, and pushed out a glossy video of her visiting elderly homes and reading to kids. She tried to reframe the story as a smear campaign by opportunistic enemies. But lies need oxygen. We were about to cut off the air. Two things unraveled her fast: the human testimonies and the dirty money. Human testimonies are the sharpest instruments. The county attorney assembled a line of witnesses like a choir of truth, Raymond with his contract files, Simone with the internal memos, Javier with the irregular deliveries, the notary estate manager with the missing stamp report, and then, heroically and painfully, my father's old neighbor, Mrs. Larkin, who'd noticed strange visitors late at night and tracked down discrepancies in property upkeep. Each testimony added weight to the pattern. People who'd once smiled for Melissa's cameras now stood in a courtroom and described an entirely different woman: furtive, controlling, and willing to manipulate the man she claimed to love. The other piece was the money trail. Daniel and the prosecutors worked like cartographers, mapping transfers between accounts, shell corporations, and purchases. They followed fences of companies registered in dead men's names and discovered a web of asset forwarding, transfers to accounts that then routed money into companies that bought art, cars, and real estate. At trial, when the prosecutor played bank statements as exhibits, a hush fell over the courtroom. The numbers, cold and indifferent, told a story of greed, funds labeled maintenance, consulting, and event fees that in reality were siphons. The private receipts proved the siphoning. Melissa's defense tried to poke holes. Her lawyers claimed incompetence, administrative oversight, and the convenient scapegoat of a rogue assistant. They blamed the notary's stamp theft on a misunderstood file transfer. They suggested my father's recordings were taken out of context. But then came the moment that broke her facade. During cross-examination, Simone, shaking but resolute, recounted the day Melissa told her to make the signatures smoother. She testified that Melissa instructed her on how to make documents appear legit. The courtroom watched a woman who'd been trained to look good in photographs recount the mechanics of forgery, how they replaced ink samples, how they used old stamps to avoid scrutiny, and how they asked drivers to take envelopes to banks. Melissa's face, age 35 or so but brittle from stress, crumpled. She had built such a professional polish of performance that the bare, plain facts of how the work was done looked crude and ugly by comparison. The jury didn't need theatrics. They had documents, witnesses, and a motive. Greed, frankly, is easy to prove when you can show receipts. In the end, the verdict came down like a slow gavel: guilty on multiple counts of forgery, elder financial exploitation, and fraud. The courtroom erupted, not in celebration but in a release of a long-held tension. She cried. She blamed me in an interview afterward, claiming I'd orchestrated a vengeful campaign. But the court had decided. The sentencing included restitution and the freezing of assets. The judge's words were careful, but they carried the weight of retribution. Melissa's charitable foundation was dissolved, bank accounts seized to cover restitution, and several of her associates faced separate investigations. It was legal victory and public humiliation braided together. The woman who'd smiled on magazine covers was being handcuffed in the back pages of the city's newspapers. I had one final trick left, not legal but beautifully theatrical. Melissa's downfall had been procedural and painstaking. It was also quiet: indictments, hearings, paperwork. I wanted one moment of pure, undeniable exposure where people would see her for what she had done without mediation. I used the fundraiser she insisted on holding as a last-minute attempt to salvage her image. She announced it with a tone of contrition, a night to raise money for the scholarship in Emma's name. Her irony was either breathtaking or tone-deaf. I pretended to accept her olive branch and agreed to attend, not as a guest, but as the face of the scholarship she claimed to be building. The city's press list was long, and Melissa was banking on that. Many would come to see redemption. I wanted them to watch the unmasking. The plan hinged on three things: an audio piece, a live reveal, and a human chorus. The audio piece was my father's confession plus selected statements from witnesses, packaged and arranged to tell the story without editorializing. The live reveal involved a projector and a stage at the fundraise. The chorus was the line of donors and board members who would stand with me. On the night of the event, cameras were everywhere. Melissa glowed like a woman reborn. She took the stage to thunderous applause and spoke about legacy, about forgiveness, about how the scholarship would ensure that young women never have to be left alone as I did. When she invited me to speak, I walked up with a calm so cold it felt rehearsed. I wasn't timid anymore. I wore my father's old watch, the one he'd given me at graduation, a tiny comfort that felt like armor. I told the crowd we were there to honor the memory of a man who had been generous and kind but who had also been taken advantage of. I spoke about truth and responsibility without venom. Then I flicked the remote and the lights dimmed. The projector came alive. The audio played. First, my father's voice, tired, small, honest. Then Simone's testimony, Javier's recollections, Raymond's contracts, the prosecutor's summary. The screen displayed documents side by side, Melissa's public photos next to the notary's stolen stamp, the foundation's glossy brochure adjacent to bank statements showing transfers into her shell accounts. The room changed. Faces paled. Phones were raised, not to film a triumph but to document the scandal unfolding. Melissa's smile froze. She had expected a redemption narrative. She had prepared a speech defending herself. No one had expected a public castigation laid out with the calm meticulousness of a prosecutor's brief. When the last audio clip ended, my father's voice whispering "forgive me," there was a silence so thick you could feel it pressing against your skin. Melissa fled the stage with a grace that broke into clumsy running near the exits. Cameras followed her. People whose donations she'd relied on were left sitting in their glossy gowns, feeling betrayed. The event ended in chaos, not celebration. I didn't gloat. I simply stood in the wreckage of her design and felt, for the first time in 2 years, a small easing of the tightness in my chest. The legal system moved slowly after that night, but its momentum was different. The spectacle had accelerated private donors' decisions. They demanded restitution and transparency. Board members resigned en masse. The charities that had once sought affiliation with Melissa publicly severed ties. Melissa's sentence was not merely punitive. It was also reparative. The judge ordered restitution to my father's estate and mandated the seizure of certain assets to repay defrauded donors. The foundation's remaining funds were redirected to legitimate organizations under court supervision. Melissa was ordered to disband her social platforms and was barred from holding fiduciary roles for a period of years. When she walked out of the courtroom, handcuffed in one phase and then released on the appeal pending, her face was drawn and small in a way that made me feel an odd, gentle pity. Not for what she'd done, but because the entire edifice that had supported her identity had been exposed as hollow. It was a tragedy of a different stripe, not the personal wound of the bereaved but the collapse of persona. People sometimes ask if revenge is satisfying. For me, it wasn't about triumph dancing on someone else's ruin. It was about correcting a ledger, legal, moral, and emotional. It was about making sure my father's name wasn't a currency for someone else's greed. In the months after the convictions and settlements, there were quiet victories. The county organized a compliance audit for charities that had worked with Melissa's foundation to ensure no further misuses of funds. The notary's estate sued for theft of property and won a civil judgment that helped with restitution. Simone received witness protection and a small stipend for her courage. Javier got a better job through Raymond's connections. The final legal closure came quietly, a meeting with the probate judge. The judge explained that while my father's will couldn't be retroactively rewritten by emotion, the criminal proceedings and restitution orders meant that a portion of the assets Melissa had seized would be directed to repay defrauded parties, including, in part, the estate. The paperwork meant that, after fees and legal processes, funds were available to fulfill some of my father's original philanthropic intentions. We used those funds to establish a legitimate scholarship in my father's name, not the flashy, PR-driven scholarship Melissa had promised, but a small, rigorous grant for construction trade students with a focus on ethical business practices, something that would have mattered to him. I sat on the scholarship committee and, weirdly, felt like I was helping continue a part of my father's life he'd intended. Sometimes revenge is loud. Sometimes it's a series of documents and court filings that read like dry paper until you realize people's lives are in the margins. For me, it was both. After the legal dust settled, I found myself standing in my father's old workshop, the place that smelled of sawdust and coffee, the real, tactile history of his life. I ran my hand over a workbench he'd sanded down one summer, the groove where he always placed a chisel. The years of aching had left me with a wound that would never fully close, but it had also left me with a hard-earned calm. My father's recordings remained the strangest comfort. In them, he was flawed and honest. The part that mattered to me wasn't that he'd been tricked, everyone can be tricked, but that he'd admitted it, even when it was too late. He owned his mistakes, and that humility mattered. I kept in touch with Raymond, and with Simone in the way the law allowed. Daniel finished law school and eventually took a job with the county, where he specialized in elder protection cases. The scholarship awarded its first student a small sum and a big responsibility, a promise to learn craftsmanship and to practice integrity. It wasn't a cure, but it was an act. And Melissa? She faded from the feeds. Her social accounts were scrubbed by court order. Her name remained in news archives for a while, a cautionary tale. She reached out once through an intermediary, asking for a meeting. I declined. There are apologies that are meant for the speaker and apologies meant to heal the listener. His recorded "forgive me" was enough for me. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about the white envelope that arrived on my kitchen counter the morning it all began. I think about the smallness of it, a single sheet of paper with legal ink that tore something open in me. I think about how betrayal is not always dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet, institutional, and bureaucratic. And sometimes the quietest things, a recording, a memo, a driver's observation, are the sharpest tools you can have. I made sure that when the truth came out, it came in full view, documents, voices, witnesses. I didn't humiliate by cruelty, I exposed by fact. I didn't enjoy the spectacle. I respected the necessity of it. At 22, I thought of the future differently. I thought less about vengeance as an end and more as a means. A way to secure a future where someone couldn't erase my father and then pose as his steward. The scholarship is small, the repairs to his name modest, but they are real. People sometimes ask if I ever forgave my father. The answer is complicated. I forgave the man I loved for being fallible. I didn't forgive the actions he allowed by silence. But I can live with both truths, that he loved me in ways he couldn't show, and that he made choices that hurt me. Small mercy, he acknowledged it. He left me enough fragments to assemble a truth. One night, a year after everything ended, I walked past the Haven. It looked the same, chic and indifferent. I thought of Melissa's final laughter, cut short not by melodrama but by the slow mechanical knowledge of law and witnesses. I sipped coffee from a paper cup and felt a steadiness that didn't need fireworks. Revenge, in its most honest form, was simply the restoration of balance. It didn't feel like triumph. It felt like settling an account so I could finally close the book and turn the page. The rest of my life would not be built on my father's estate or the scandal that swallowed his second marriage. It would be built in small rooms with sawdust and scholarship checks, in the faces of students given a modest chance, and in the steady, quiet life I hope to lead, careful, honest, and, finally, my own.